This episode is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by The Syllabus, a nonprofit knowledge discovery service founded by friend of the pod, Yevgeny Morozov. The Syllabus is doing artisanal automation. How does that work? Well, they use technology to monitor thousands of sources, and each week, human creators, that is, actual people, handpick the best of what's been published on the internet. When you sign up, you'll begin crafting your custom feed, picking from 6 languages and 60 topics, like far-right populism or energy and extractivism, heterodox economics, or AI and automation. Everything is there. Each Monday, you'll get a new batch of personalized recommendations of essays and books, academic articles and reports, videos, and even, yes, podcasts. I highly recommend that Dig listeners check out The Syllabus. Visit their website at the-syllabus.com. That's the-syllabus.com. They offer 2-week free trials, and if you enter DIG at checkout, you'll get 30% off your first year. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. Trump's manifold idiosyncrasies have always mystified the reality that the ascendant MAGA far-right has deep roots in ordinary American politics and absolutely profound continuities with the orthodox conservative movement as we have long known it. That said, it's a big mistake to deny the ruptures and radicalizations underway. Today, I'm interviewing Quinn Slobodian and Wendy Brown, and we're discussing the ever-emergent trajectory of Trumpism and the MAGA far-right. We really don't know what's going to happen, so this is all a bit tentative, even speculative. It's an early effort to start thinking about how to think about what's taking shape. Before we get started, though, if you appreciate The Dig, if you depend on us for analysis at a depth combined with an all-consuming breadth that you can't find elsewhere, support us with a monthly or annual contribution at patreon.com/thedig. Here's our basic proposition. Many podcasts paywall episodes to generate revenue, which makes sense because podcasts need revenue. But we do not paywall anything because we are a political education project and we want everyone on earth possible to listen. So we paywall nothing. But that only works because listeners like you voluntarily contribute. We also send our newsletter to every Patreon supporter by email. And depending on where you live and how much you contribute, we have gifts like tote bags, coffee mugs, books to send you in the mail. That's patreon.com/thedig. Finally, one last thing. If you have not listened to Thawrawith, our series on the history of 20th century Arab radicalism, you should. If you have listened to Thawrawith, you should share it with a friend. Either way, please know that we have a feed dedicated entirely to the series. There's a link in the show notes. Please check it out and spread the word. We want Thawrawith to be a political education project that's useful to people over the long haul. Please listen and please spread the word. Okay, here's Quinn Slobodian and Wendy Brown. Quinn Slobodian is professor of international history at the Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. I've interviewed Quinn twice before on this podcast, once to discuss each of his 2 books. First, Globalists, The End of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism, and Crack Up Capitalism, Market Radicals and the Dream of a World Without Democracy. His forthcoming book this spring is Hayek's Bastards, Race, Gold, IQ, and the Capitalism of the Far Right. Wendy Brown is UPS professor of social science at the Institute for Advanced Study, Princeton. I've interviewed Wendy before, including on her previous very relevant book, In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, The Rise of Anti-Democratic Politics in the West. Her most recent book is Nihilistic Times, Thinking with Max Weber. She's currently writing a book on reparative democracy. Quinn Slobodian and Wendy Brown. Welcome back to The Dig.
Thank you.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's start with the economics, where the contradictions of MAGA's politics have been very clearly reproduced in Trump's nominations. First, you have the marquee economic nationalism, these promises of tariffs and trade wars, and that's paired with figures like former U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, who may or may not return to that role once again. Then you have these various strains of far-right libertarianism emerging, in particular from Silicon Valley, most evident maybe with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy's strange new role at DOGE, the not actual government agency that will be recommending how to make deep, deep cuts in government named after the cryptocurrency Dogecoin. Thirdly, there are these more traditional forms of right-wing capital, probably best represented by Trump's picks for Treasury and Commerce, both of which come from Wall Street. Then there's this guy that I was just reading up on, the new appointment to run the Office of Management and Budget, Russell Vought, who was a leader of Project 2025, and his thing seems to be destroying the administrative state. And I'm not sure which camp he would belong to, or if he's instead maybe a point of synthesis and connection across the three camps. There's so many disagreements over monopolies, consumer protections, what to do about the labor market, whether to support American workers or to make the labor market scream, entitlements, whether the government, a sort of chauvinist welfare state, has a principal role to play incentivizing families. Does MAGA economic politics form a cohesive ideology even while it's an internally contradictory one? And if there is a cohesive ideology here, has that ideology taken coherent shape at the level of theory or a self-conscious political formula, or does it mostly find its coherency in the individual person of Donald Trump?
I do think that cohesive ideology is probably not our best friend analytically here. And I think the left probably should give it up because we're always looking for it. And that always means we miss really important features of a multi-pronged project for remaking the state. And that's how I would understand both the economic and the social project of Project 2025 and Trumpism more generally. I do think economically, all of these tributaries are projects of remaking the state for capital, from the proposal to curtail an independent Fed, to building a crypto reserve, to policies toward China. Contradictory, as you mentioned. The trade and tariff policies can go in several different directions. How to do all of this without inflation, how to cut taxes massively for the wealthy while funding some new projects for the state, which threaten, I think the figure I saw last was a $13 trillion increase in the debt by the time Trump's legacy is over, which is not 4 years from now, but maybe a decade from now. What I do think links them all, and this will be a provocation to Quinn, so this is where I'll conclude, is Melinda Cooper's beautifully titled Extravagance and Austerity, her last book. I don't remember the whole title of the book, but those are the key words. Extravagance for capital and of capital, and austerity, obviously, for the people. So extravagance at the level of deregulation, letting oil go wide, tax cuts for the wealthy that I've already mentioned, but austerity at the level of education, healthcare, support of social services of every kind, from Head Start to food stamps. And I think we also need to remember that as wild as Trumponomics promises to be in important ways, and I do think we need to talk about the new OMB head and how much power he's likely to have in building budgets. That's what that office does. It builds the budget for Trump. So we'll maybe talk about that down the road. But as wild as Trumponomics promises to be, it's still supply side economics. Even with crypto and possible crypto reserves, only it's supply side economics with tax cuts, whereas Biden gave us supply side economics with tax credits. So there's still some basic trajectories that we can follow here. But I think rather than thinking about it ideologically, we need to think about the concrete projects of state making and state remaking that Trumponomics is promising that's very different from just imagining the old neoliberal antagonism to the state that is the caricature of neoliberalism that neither Quinn nor I believe in.
Yeah, Quinn. I mean, one thing to add briefly, though, extravagance also operative at the level of Trump's aesthetic, all marble, gold, just luxury at its most trashy extreme.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about trying to get our heads around this now, I think, is that we've been here before, right? I mean, it's kind of incredible to see everyone kind of rolling out the takes from 2017 without kind of reflecting on what we've learned in the meantime. So I think there are some things, and I agree with Wendy, that are similar to then, and there are some things that are different. I think I hope to have a chance a bit later to talk about some of the things that are different, because I do think crypto is a big difference. I think more than ever, not only entertainment, but also sports is a very important sort of touchstone and reference point for this new administration. But I think the tripartite kind of loose coalition that we've come to kind of call Trumpism is more or less the same from Trump 1. And that, I think, has basically three groups. The first, and I think probably the least influential, although arguably the most interesting, is the kind of post-neoliberal right? So this is the national conservatism position that one figurehead like Robert Lighthizer, who you mentioned at the top, could be seen as an important representative of. Someone who managed to attach to the locomotive of Trump in 2017 a totally transformed understanding of what trade policy should do. He just completely broke. He broke with the kind of shibboleths of free trade that had dominated both parties for decades, and said that trade policy doesn't just have to aim at bottom line efficiency and the best sort of international division of labor, but you can do other things with trade policy. You can try to reach minimum labor standards. You can try to reach economic and political goals of bringing back manufacturing to the Midwest. You can try to diversify the US economic base. This was actually, I think, a very big deal. And it's not for nothing that Biden and company picked it up and tried to do different things with trade policy, different kind of political outcomes. So far, I think it's very symptomatic that here we are weeks into the process of hearing new names, and we haven't even seen Lighthizer's name officially attached to any post yet. The only person who you might consider part of this kind of national conservatism bloc, the idea of using the state more proactively for an expansionary transformation of the US economy, is Marco Rubio. But he gets put as Secretary of State, very far from the sort of position in which he could actually affect something like industrial policy, even if he wanted to be true to his word in the last few years. So that post-neoliberal NatCon position in the Republican Party, which people probably have exaggerated the importance of, so far has effectively no representation in the cabinet that he's assembling. Instead, we have another group that I think you could call basically the growthers, or just growthism. These are the people who are drawn from Wall Street. This is the place where Scott Bessent, the nominee for Treasury, who was literally working for Soros and helped him break the pound, and then founded a hedge fund with Soros's backing, and deals in the sort of at the sort of bleeding edge of speculative investments on new technologies and, sure shot things like carbon-driven extraction and real estate. Really just run-of-the-mill. Growther was a Democrat until he saw that the Trump bet could pay off, and then jumped over to Trump in 2016-17. The other people around Trump, like Mark Rowan from Apollo Management, even more extreme kind of vulture capitalist, doing private equity deals to basically strip value out of rural hospitals and care homes and then sell them off to different parts of the company. So this is the kind of growth at all costs part of the coalition, which arguably is the dominant part. I think these are the people who Howard Lutnick, now at Commerce, was on the transition team coming from Cantor Fitzgerald. This is, in a way, intellectually and politically the least interesting, even if perhaps civilizationally the most destructive part of this coalition. The third is the other one that you mentioned a minute ago, Russ Vought, who comes from, I would say, the kind of Austerian libertarianism, Grover Norquist, right? Shrink the state down so you can drown in a bathtub. Pure think tank blood just flowing in his veins. And there it's just, as you say, get rid of what he calls the fourth wing of the government, which is the administrative state of civil servants. And for what end? To, produce a crisis in which the federal government itself cannot function anymore, defund the IRS to the point that there's no revenue at all coming from taxes. I mean, I think that is definitely part of the idea. But then what follows is that idea of a devolution of all administrative responsibility down in a subsidiarity way to state and counties. Probably that's part of the idea. That is concerning, obviously, but does seem to be the kind of direction of travel of people who are ideologically committed to decentralization in a way that I think might even take precedent over the pursuit of the bottom line in a way that the Wall Street faction, I think, is more focused on. So that, I think, the tussle between those three groups is what defined Trump 1, and it will be what defines Trump 2. And for the time being, it looks like old-fashioned Wall Street, mostly vulture capitalists, are the ones who are getting closest to his ear.
You said that Lighthizer probably represents the least influential economic current there. What about J.D. Vance and his paternalist, populist, welfare chauvinism, or the new labor secretary who, as a House Republican, voted for the PRO Act, an appointment that was disturbingly very effusively praised by Teamsters president Sean O'Brien. Is all of that, whatever the work it's doing as a politics and an ideology, is it all just sort of impossible as policy as long as these various capitalists are actually running the show?
I mean, I think it's a question of how much power a vice president has, right? I mean, obviously they're important during the campaign as sort of messengers of the intended spirit of the incoming administration. But after that, how much do we care about Pence's economic vision? How much do we care about, Kamala Harris's economic vision before she became the candidate? I think I have yet to be convinced that the kind of NatCon, laborist, workerist version of the GOP is actually able to translate its rhetoric into any kind of policy, except to sideline unions as kind of bearers of blocks of voters and redirect the idea towards individual workers as sort of political actors making their own choices. But the labor secretary is an interesting one. I don't know if you have a thought about her, Wendy.
I guess I just want to go back to the important point that as long as we're thinking about a coherent economic policy, we'll be stuck down where your question went just now. How is it all going to be reconciled? But it seems to me it is perfectly possible to have an unreconciled economic policy with, there are a lot of eyes on China. Even there's going to be several different kinds of moves, anxiety about what China can and can't be forced to do, what will and won't be inflationary in trade policy and tariffs with China, but also just what products the U.S. can make that could possibly compete with Chinese products. And so there's a whole bunch of discussion over there that is conflicted, and some policy will have to come out of it. But that's different than saying we need one reconciled policy for labor in the US, for different kinds of capital, for tech capital, finance capital, and of course, industrial capital. And I take really seriously Quinn's growthers term, because I think that is what binds them. But I think it's possible to imagine, I want to say, a controlled chaos in economic policy that is disruptive, but above all, aims at transforming the state's relationship to that policy and the state's own engagement. And on the one hand, there's crypto, which promises, if these guys get their way, to bind the state more closely to crypto than it ever has been, if that reserve idea gets legs. And on the other hand, there's the gutting, the potential gutting of a huge number of state functions, which I assume we'll talk about in a few minutes, that would be the effect of Project 2025 and has a couple of instruments, most notably transforming a bunch of career state workers into political appointments. And that's one instrument. And the other one is impoundment, allowing budgets to come directly from the executive office and take effect, and allowing budgetary moves to not have to move through legislation. And that those things would be huge transformations of the American state, not necessarily bound to one coherent economic policy. And this is why I urged us to be speculative here rather than sure, because I think if some of these novel instruments and novel projects of going deep into the administrative state, not just to wipe out jobs, but to transform them into political appointments. If that takes effect, we're in a different economic order in the US than we've been in, even though it's still capital and capital on steroids. It has some post-neoliberal dimensions because it's certainly not just about deregulation, but it's also about deregulation. So we need to be open to what Quinn and co-authors have already given us as new potential political and economic formations coming out of this potentially radically remade state.
Yeah, I do agree that it's important not to try to seek the essence of this. I think thinking about what we learned from last time, that one of the mistakes was thinking there was some distillable Trumpism that we could draw out of this. I think that what Wendy is saying about the kind of uncertainty is also a tactical matter, right? I mean, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, said this openly. We're basically using these tariff threats of maximalism as a kind of negotiating tactic. Where, as he said, we're escalating to de-escalate, right? It's very symptomatically using the same terminology that the Israelis used for the attacks in southern Lebanon. So there's the transactional art of the deal part of this, which once again we should have learned the first time around, which is he doesn't always mean everything he says. He produces,
and we could add even the Matt Gaetz nomination had that quality. Now, in the rearview mirror, looks more like provocation and clearing the way for easy affirmation of his less pugilistic nominees than anything else. Go ahead.
Yeah, you test the limits of how far the envelope can be pushed. You find out. But I think, even while that's happening, this sort of like wrecking ball or poker player approach, there is back end stuff happening, which I think is really important to watch too. So one example, this fellow Mark Rowan, who was in consideration for the position of treasurer and has been working with Trump in the transition, has given $12 million to his alma mater and Trump's alma mater, Wharton, to help develop this thing called the Penn-Wharton budget model, which is basically a new kind of handy interactive tool for individual citizens, but also for policymakers to plug in the outcome of certain kind of policy changes. So what would happen if we, let in fewer immigrants? What would happen if we raised tariffs on Chinese products? What would the difference in the projected GDP be? What would the difference in the projected budget be? And economists, one after the other, have looked at this thing and said it's basically biased towards saying, don't expand state expenditure of any kind because it's going to, have these negative effects. But this is a kind of a rewiring of the kind of back end of the administrative state that is not the same as, firing 1/3 of federal employees, as Vivek and Musk claim that they want to do. But, arguably more effective because you're putting this sort of wonky technocratic tool into the hands of the quote moderates, who can then appeal to hard numbers to roll out, like the eroding cuts happening through more conventional means, even as the kind of wrecking ball stuff happens with the other hand, as it were. So I think, we kind of need to not just look where the fireworks are, but be attentive also to kind of the back end machinery too.
Is the campaign against the administrative state that we see both in Trump's nominations and also very clearly in recent Supreme Court rulings against Chevron deference, is this a key point upon which to establish the basic continuities between traditional conservatism and this ostensibly far more radical Trumpism that's supposed to be such a dramatic departure?
It's a great question. I think another way of putting it might be, is this finally kind of calling traditional conservatism on its long hostility to state spending, to state employees, to state agencies, to all of that, and just how horrified are traditional conservatives going to be as they watch their ideological vision enacted? Can we start talking about Project 2025? Because I think,
I always think it's a perfect time. Yeah.
Please.
yeah, that's where we really see it. So, well, everybody's heard of it at this point who would listen to your podcast, obviously, and nobody's read the 900 pages. Let's make those two assumptions. It's been depicted as the equivalent of a Federalist Society project for the American legal and juridical system, the equivalent for the entire political system. And I think that's actually a smart analogy. As people may or may not know, it was certainly masterminded by Russell Vought, now the OMB nominee, a very nerdy looking and very nerdy sounding arch Christian nationalist. We need all of those adjectives in play. It, however, it involved more than 100 conservative organizations, some very well known, and some that very few of us have heard of, even who pay attention to right-wing organizations. Now that Russell Vought is the OMB nominee who will literally build the Trump budgets, what this will allow him to do is what Chris Rufo, so far not appointed to anything, but I assume he'll be some kind of undersecretary in education or somewhere. He'll be presumably at least hanging around the DOE. Chris Rufo put it really succinctly. What the OMB nominee will be able to do vis-a-vis Project 2025 is, as Chris put it, fund what we like and defund what we don't. And we're not just talking about programs like Head Start and Medicaid. We're talking about entire agencies and departments. Project 2025 calls for defunding the Department of Justice, the Department of Education, the FBI, the EPA, or its successor, various other kinds of agencies and organizations, the Weather Agency that among other things reveals the effects of climate change. And it has in it two crucial instruments that I mentioned by which the Trump regime could do an enormous amount with and to the state. The first one we've already all been alluding to. It's reclassifying federal career employees as political appointees. Career employees are all those engineers and nurses and doctors, and they're not just quote unquote bureaucrats. They're people with a lot of expertise who run all the federal agencies and keep all the things going that we need. So this would literally transform the nature of government work. If 50,000 of several million career employees could be reclassified as political appointees, what it would allow the regime to do is fill positions deep in every agency, not just with Trump loyalists, but with people who won't say, no, we can't do that. It's illegal or it's inconstitutional or it's just poor thinking. And instead to enact a lot of the stuff that otherwise these relative know-nothings who are nominees for each department secretary might not be able to pull off. But if you can get a deep bench in each department of political appointees, this really changes the game. This changes the state. It will also obviously lead to a number of resignations and could foment what we could call a kind of authoritarianism or a kind of chaos. Or, my prediction, a chaotic authoritarianism, a way of doing administrative work that isn't built on much knowledge or evidence or expertise, but has a lot of what we political theorists call Schmittian decisionism in it, just power. it means on a substantive level, the FDA being run by non-medical people, the DOJ being run by people who don't know the law, the DOE by people who don't have a clue about education. And it means illegal and unconstitutional procedures rolled out everywhere. So that's one crucial thing, one crucial instrument that the Trump administration is likely to revive. And it's crucial to mention that it was the Trump administration that came up with this policy late in the first term. Then Biden reversed it, and Trump will likely reinstate it. So that's one thing. And then the other instrument I want to mention is the Impoundment Control Act. More nerdiness. This is a 1974 act that responded to Nixon's overreach with the budget. And it was basically to prevent the executive power from being able to just fund what they wanted to fund and defund what they didn't like. So here we get back to Ramaswamy and Musk, because with Doge, their plan is to use the Supreme Court to challenge that 1974 act. And if they are successful, which they hope to be by the time we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the US on July 4th, 2026, if they're successful, they can, as one GOPer put it, get rid of all this legislative BS to get things done. Now, that's another strong authoritarian move. I am not one prone to the hyperbole of fascism or authoritarianism in talking about our new regime, but I think Project 2025, both its design for America and what it wants to attack and what it wants to build, but also the instruments that it would use, are so deeply assaulting the legislative process for legislating policy and funding that policy. And they are so deeply attacking the administrative process for career officials and appointees in favor of political loyalists, that's where, instead of Trump 1, where Trump got to office, didn't expect to be in office, didn't know what to do with the office, and really blew a lot of capital as a result, Project 2025 was to make sure that that wouldn't happen. And I'll sum it up this way and then stop. The first time Trump was elected, there were those in the GOP who said, oh, it's okay. He's a clown, but all we need him to do is sign the legislation. What Project 2025 guarantees is that you don't have to work with legislation. You can just work with executive power. And that project was a really smart one. It's coalitional. It's got instruments. It's got a design. I wouldn't worry so much about a coherent ideology. It's exactly what the left doesn't do.
Yeah, once again, I think it's important to say what is similar and what's different in this present iteration of a right-wing Republican administration. Because on the one hand, Project 2025 is just the latest version of the Mandate for Leadership that the Heritage Foundation first put together, multi-100-page set of sort of policy ideas on SPAC that they handed the Reagan administration in 1980 and have done for every Republican president since, including Trump in 2016. There was a Mandate for Leadership that they handed him there. And they have, I think, cleverly spent the intervening years building a kind of a coalition, in some cases letting go of their positions on neoconservative foreign policy, of which we'll talk about, I'm sure, soon, and in some cases letting go of their more dogmatic attitudes towards free trade, which we've already spoken about, to get to a kind of buy-in of the kind that Wendy is just describing so well, I think, of a kind of big tent of conservative organizations with, it must be said, as Wendy, I think, also rightly emphasized, a very strong representation of overtly Christian nationalist think tanks to give a kind of a blueprint that that everyone can buy a part of. One of the, I think, virtues, the perverse virtues, I guess, of this attack on the administrative state is to make us all kind of look again at what the administrative state actually is, right? And if you look at how many employees there are in the various agencies and departments that we've just been discussing the potentially new leadership of, it's actually kind of interesting, right? Treasury has 100,000 employees worldwide. Health and Human Services, to be led by RFK Jr., about whom we'll definitely be speaking, 80,000 employees. Commerce, 50,000 employees. What's the biggest federal agency or department? Veterans Affairs, 400,000 employees, right? 4 times bigger than something like Treasury.
It's a little welfare state for veterans.
Absolutely. And that's the one that, Hegseth was discussed in the last administration as maybe becoming the secretary of, and was seen as, not fit for. But, it's worth saying that where is the little welfare state? Well, yes, it is the U.S. military, as it has so often been in the past. So I think there is that vision is still there. I mean, many of these agencies and departments have been on the chopping block as far as sort of Heritage Foundation, Austerian conservatives have been concerned since their creation, right? I mean, since the 1970s. But then I think it forces us to ask not only what would the consequences be of them actually being able to follow through on more of these plans than they've been able to in the past, but also what's different and what has kind of got us to the level of consent that we've arrived at here for these plans in 2024 that we had not seen really in 2020, and not even in terms of vote share in 2016. And there, if it's not the worst time to bring this up, there's sort of 3 C's that I'd like to mention, because I think this is, for me, the 3 things that are different from 2016, most importantly. The first one is COVID. I think that we really can't understate how we've had it's been a slow, because we expected all politics to change so quickly overnight in the course of the pandemic, and they sort of did, but then they seemed to snap back so quickly. I think that we've decided to kind of shelve the importance of the pandemic as a tidal change in the way that politics works, not just in the US, but we can definitely say in Europe as well and beyond. But decision to do a full shutdown and a lockdown, to do mask mandates, to do mandatory closures, to send everyone home from school, has produced an enormous reservoir of resentment and anger in American people and really electorates worldwide. The idea that was popular amongst probably people like us, that this was a kind of a technocratic and even a collective miracle that we were able to get everyone to agree to these restrictions for the most part and contain deaths, lower than the worst estimates had expected. Vaccination rollouts happened, pretty smoothly and effectively. Well, I think the dissenters from that sort of feeling of triumph around even things like the direct cash payments and so on is much more significant than we realize. And it specifically hits, I think, a kind of person who's an independent contractor, a person who works for themselves, a person who doesn't have a safety net built into the mini welfare states that larger firms actually often are as well for people, or certainly were when they were offering furloughs and the chance to work from home and so on. So I think that anger at the state is more immediate, and it offers a kind of a reflexive, a kind of a something that can be tapped into very, very easily and effectively, not just, of course, by the right, but also, as the examples of people like RFK Jr. show us, by the left too. The other thing, though, is crypto. So this has come up already a bit, but a couple of numbers just to make us realize how much crypto has changed in the intervening years since Trump won. So on election day in 2016, a Bitcoin was worth $700. On election day in 2020, it was worth $15,000. On election day in 2024, it was worth $70,000. And today it's about $100,000. So this is an unbelievably exponential growth in value of us, even if you just think of it as a speculative asset that's held by a particular sort of socially networked group of people and can't really expand out for reasons of the kind of stickiness of the Bitcoin as a kind of asset that people tend to hold rather than trade. And that, I think, has catapulted Silicon Valley and the VC class into this position of influence in the Trump coalition and produced a sense of envy and awe, I think, in a lot of the American population when they look at the people who got in on that train, got on that rocket. And now, when Elon is standing next to Trump and praising him, when Trump is speaking at the Bitcoin conference, launching his own NFTs of himself as a muscle-bound superhero and gladiator, or whatever the other images are, there's a sense of futurity to this that I think is very strong, that wasn't there in 2016, when it was very backward-looking, Make America Great Again. It was about restoring this past, arguably kind of a musty, boomerish kind of idea of the Leave It to Beaver 50s or something that, if you're young, really, what's in it for you except that you get to piss off some libs? But now I think you could genuinely argue, because of crypto, that the Trump coalition had a kind of a whiff of the future to it. And the last thing that I'll mention is, I think, also related to the youth share of the vote, is, just because it's a C, cage fighting. But really what I mean by that is UFC. As this is, when I was just reading up ahead of this interview, this was the thing that actually began to impress itself on me as kind of like the key to understanding this version of Trump, is UFC mixed with Worldwide Wrestling Entertainment, or formerly known as WWF, which of course we've had a million opinions about how Trump is sort of a heel figure from wrestling. We've all seen the clips of him, shaving the head of Vince McMahon in the center of the ring. And the idea of kayfabe has become a kind of a byword for people trying to analyze the present moment. But if you just look at the kind of political economy of wrestling and UFC, it's very interesting. So forgive me just this short kind of like biographical digression. So the UFC was not that popular several years ago. It was kind of popular. It was sort of catapulted to its present status as a place that, Trump would take his friends and victors for right after the election at Madison Square Garden, really during COVID lockdown. So during COVID lockdown, the Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund, which owned a pretty big chunk of the UFC, offered to create an artificial island off the coast of Abu Dhabi that was informally called Fight Island, where you had also Ferrari World, an F1 racing track, a huge water park, a place for pop concerts. And they had the cage matches, they had the UFC fights on this island during lockdown when everything else was shut down. And this is when a lot of young people actually got into UFC, because it was the only sport that was happening. But when it comes to a sport, it has a lot in common with wrestling and very little in common with other sports, in the sense that UFC and Worldwide Entertainment are basically one team, right? It's like a league in which there's one team. There's not a bunch of teams competing against each other. There's a bunch of independent contractors who all work for the CEO of the league. And therefore,
one team and no union.
One team and critically no union, and no health benefits or retirement in something that, even if it is faked, is extremely punishing. Amazingly, this is one of the, I guess, business secrets of the McMahons, Vince and Linda McMahon, is they actually were able to get a lot of the regulations lifted on wrestling by confessing that it was fake. So when they confessed it was fake publicly, it no longer fell into the category of sports. You didn't need to have doctors nearby. You didn't need to have health checkups on the performers, because now they weren't athletes, they were just performers. But they're still jumping off the top rope and collapsing onto the canvas and everything. So they're hurting themselves. The people involved with the UFC and Worldwide Entertainment are really at the heart of Trump's organizational machine, right? Linda McMahon co-led his transition team with Howard Lutnick, who's now head of commerce. Linda McMahon will be the next education secretary. She also co-founded the America First Policy Institute with Larry Kudlow et al. That has, if you want to know what we have on the horizon for education, go to the America First Policy Institute and look at their list of suggestions. It includes ideas like making Pell Grants available for people to do things like coding boot camps and 3D printing of tools for factories. Argument being, if you don't have to import the tool from China or the part from China and you can 3D print it here in the United States, you've solve two things at once. You've created a job and you've also delinked yourself from Chinese dependency. But she was the CEO of World Wrestling Entertainment for years. The person who currently owns what's called TKO Holdings, which holds both Worldwide Wrestling Entertainment and the UFC, is Ari Emanuel, who was Trump's agent before he ran for president. He bought Miss Universe off of Trump before he ran for president. He also happens to be Rahm Emanuel's brother. He was the person who Ari Gold was based off of in Entourage and has now become kind of one of the people in the close circle with Trump. So I think that if you think about this sort of complex of, social Darwinists, sort of bloody, hyper-masculine, violent, merciless competition that has no off-season, right? Again, different from regular sports. You don't get summer, you don't get spring training. You're fighting all year round. And when you are too broken to fight, then you just limp away and you try to figure out how to make a life out of what's left of your body. It starts to feel like a real metaphor for the kind of economy or the political economy that, Trump celebrates and has found hyper successful. The TKO Holdings stock price has risen 75% in the last year. It's as a kind of a success story. So on the one hand, I think we have to see the sort of negative side of the project is to take apart, dismantle the administrative state. But what's the productive side, right? Like what is being liberated when those scaffoldings are sort of removed and those sort of the buttresses are taken off of the economy? I think it's a kind of political economy of something like fighting and cage fighting with all of its celebrity and its excess and even its kind of extravagance.
Just want to note on the UFC front that Trump, alongside Dana White, the head of UFC, Trump has been at Dana White's side this entire period, it becoming the phenomenon that it now is.
Yeah, and he spoke at the RNC and so on, yeah.
Wendy?
Just a little footnote. I believe you have in mind that we'll speak about gender later, but I would say the complement to Quinn's really beautiful account of fighting until you've broken your body and limping away is the Miss Universe pageants and the whole world of everything from sex work to beauty as work that works for the other pole of gender politics in Trump's coalition. And it's the same. You do it until you're broken or finished, and then you limp away and with luck find a job at Target.
One last question on the administrative state. The administrative state, the federal bureaucracy, all the expertise involved. The idea there is that this is what's needed for a state to manage a large, complex capitalist economy and society. And then the right-wing attack on the administrative state is made in the name of it's a small d democratic critique. That's the pretext, that these agencies have taken on powers that rightly belong to officials elected by the people, in this case, the president. But of course, destroying the administrative state would not result in any sort of direct democratic control of the federal government. It would put capital often in this sort of direct and unmediated form of control. So the question I wanted to ask was, don't capitalists need the administrative state to reproduce the conditions that make the capitalist order possible? An American capitalist order that, under recent conditions, has delivered just such an obscene amount of wealth to the very top of the economy. What do they want? And are there sectors of capital who might be nervous about this all?
I mean, I think the sectors of capital that supported Kamala, which is to say most of them, are the ones that were nervous about this, right? And the ones who lined up with Trump and are the chancers who saw that they had a lot to gain from this. And they've been proven correct. I think they're going to gain a lot. And if you look at the way that the stock market has responded in general, it's been buoyant, right? I mean, this has been welcomed by the markets to maybe even more of an extent than people had expected. I think one thing I wanted to say quickly, and then I'd love to hear what Wendy had to say to this, is the way I think that the timelines have been kind of stretched out this time around. So if the Make America Great Again moment first time around, Mark 1, 2016, was still kind of about getting back to Trump's childhood, getting back to the boomers' childhood. And therefore, someone like Buchanan or Friedman could seem like the kind of right reference point. I think many of us have thought about Murray Rothbard as being someone who seems a bit more fitting for the present moment, because we've stretched back another 50 years before 1950 to the turn of the century. Howard Lutnick, Incoming Commerce, referenced this directly in his RNC speech, where he said, if you go back 100 years ago, we were where we wanted to be 150 years ago. There was no income tax and everything was paid for by tariffs, right? Quote unquote. Or we were rockin', I think, is the way he put it. That's a Rothbard line, right? Repeal the 20th century. Get the state out of our business. So there is an argument to be made that the United States maybe is more centralized, does have more administrative apparatus than might be optimal for someone who had total disinterest in the well-being of much of the population, right? Like, I think that there is an argument for like a leaner version of the machinery necessary to just do accumulation and profit. It would look different. But I think if you just say we only care about, the well-being of the workers in the oil patch and we don't care what happens to their families back home or whatever, then you get more to the Gulf model of you zone specific parts of the country for certain functions. You give those workers certain privileges, not beyond the gate, so to speak. And it looks more like company towns in the 19th century, which is not coincidentally one of the touchstones for someone like Musk. So I think we've got that timeline stretched backwards, but then the timeline is stretched forwards too. So there's a kind of futurism too, where people like Musk and other people in the tech right imagine that the legacy nation state is a kind of dinosaur that is on its way out, and that there will be a more nimble kind of mosaic of jurisdictions and spaces, which the current centralized administrative Hulk and Leviathan is only the kind of the last version of.
I think the critique of the administrative state has what you called a small d democratic dimension. Historically, Quinn gave us that history. I don't think that's the power in the current critique. I think it has more to do with two things. One, we've already talked about consolidating and elaborating executive power, which Trump has always said the administrative state, or what he calls the deep state, gets in the way of. He can't do the things he wants to because he feels his legs are all tangled up in the swamp. On the other hand, I think it's a problem for capital. The administrative state is either too regulatory or too public. So what are capital's two drives? To privatize and to deregulate. And that's not democratizing. So I think, while I agree, of course, there is always room to slenderize and make more efficient or make more effective, I would say, the administrative state in the US. There's no need to defend it tout court, which is my fear of what liberals and the left will do, which is exactly what liberals and the left did with the rise of Reaganism. It was as they saw Reagan coming for the state and rolling out, we could call it neoliberalism 1.0, all these old lefties rose to defend everything about it. And that was, the beginning of the end for us. Because while I think I disagree with Quinn on one minor thing, I don't think there is the degree of hostility to the state in the people that Quinn depicted. I think it's hostility to a problematic or ill-run state, a state that I wouldn't even say feels rigged, but feels like it has some favoritism in it. That's what all the racism is about, where it favors, underrepresented groups and so on and so forth. But I think that in many ways, what Trump got this time was an activated piece of a base for him that is basically voting for a social state that works for them, that provisions the education and the healthcare and the income level and the security that the working and lower middle class feels they've lost. And they are not just looking to markets to provide that. Most of the country has gotten wise about what markets do. They were looking to a better manager of the state than they knew Kamala would be, and they thought Trump would be. And we don't need to litigate that. We're not doing that kind of a podcast today. But I don't think it's massive hostility to the state. I think Capitol has that massive hostility, and I think Trump and his cronies have that massive hostility because they want to do things. And the administrative state, as it is, ties their hands too much. And that's what getting rid of a lot of career employees is, and that's what getting rid of certain agencies is about. Of course, there are certain ideological projects. I assume we'll talk about education a bit more later on. Getting rid of massive infusions to, ironically, poor schools, poor students, et cetera, from the Fed, which of course will hit red states the hardest. But those are particular projects, and I want to suggest that the more general hostility to the administrative state comes to us from Capitol, and the particular version of it that we get from the techies also has a strong political edge. Just let us run things. And I assume we'll be talking about that as well. The anarcho-technocratic thing emerging from Silicon Valley and elsewhere is we do it better. We know how to design things, and we know how to make things work that states don't and political formations don't.
If I could just respond to the one little part of that. I mean, I surely agree with you that this was also a critique not just of the state per se, but of what they perceived as a poorly run state. But I think that the nature of the sort of transformations of political economy, especially the digitization of political economy, have really, I think, changed the horizon of expectations for a lot of people. The idea of I've sort of thought about Trump as like a meme stock president, right? Like his social media network is another case in point that only makes something like $20 million or made $2 million this year. And it has a $6 billion equity valuation, right? Like this vision of success as not really hard work, within which a state performs necessary functions of social, aiding social reproduction, but rather just, lottery style, the attempt to kind of boost your clout through whatever mean you can to rank up your stats in the way that Michelle Fair has written so well about, I think can't be underestimated. In that framework, the state is only a spoiler, right? The state can never help the influencer or kind of help enable the next meme stock from going to the moon. It can only appear as an obstacle, even if, as we all know, markets are products of states and lawcraft themselves.
Wendy, you've warned us against looking for coherence here is maybe a way to square the circle between the different emphases in the arguments that each of you is putting forth, that part of what's going on here is this populist meme stock politics with material roots in these people who are full-time influencers. And then another part of what's going on, this resonance of the promise of the security that a sort of welfare chauvinism could provide. And then regardless of what any of these people want, what they're going to get is the Project 2025 destruction of the administrative state.
Which is neither. Exactly. That seems right. Well done. Good interviewing technique. Look, having lived in this country for a very long time and tried to pay attention to it, both through punditry and through scholarship, I still feel like I don't understand it. And what I particularly don't understand, for example, is how much of that universe, influencers, crypto boys, meme stuff, how big is that? You've given us the numbers employed in influencing, employed in quotes, but how big is that as a percentage of Trump's base? And how big is the suburban white Pennsylvania, not just Pennsylvania, how big is the suburban white voter? And increasingly, of course, Latinx and Black voter who don't even understand these domains, aren't participating in these domains. And I don't mean don't understand at an insulting level. I just mean that's not where they're living. They're not living in the world of crypto, of influencers, or really of the tech bro world more generally. And I think it's really something we all have to be careful of when we get excited about these particular niches that we unfold and understand, and they're new, and they certainly are the Musk Ramaswamy world. I mean, the Doge guys will be animated by what Quinn just described, but then there's another one, and I don't want to say they are the ones who I'm calling proto-social democrats, but I do think there's some proto-social democracy running across these two domains.
Well, I mean, I don't know what the class profile is of those influencers, but I would be surprised if it was primarily middle and upper middle class, right? I don't think
I wasn't
yeah,
suggesting it was middle and upper middle class. I think it's a lot of young people who found their way to doing this, and some of them are doing it in their mother's basements, and some of them are doing it in, slightly nicer digs. They're doing a little better. So I agree. It wasn't a class thing. I was actually talking more about culture, region, domain, ways of life. I don't think most of those influencers are spending their Saturdays at Costco trying to figure out how to make ends meet through deals and arrangements that I just think we've got several different sectors here that we have to keep before us so we don't end up saying Trump's the crypto president. He is that. There's definitely that, but not only.
yeah, no, like the silver bullet explanation is definitely another thing that we should have learned from last time around. I mean, I think that, it's also the nature of our lines of work. We're not pollsters, we're not political scientists in the quantitative sense. We're people who do kind of qualitative research, and we theorize, and we try to put together these big things. And in that sense, I think certain things can feel symptomatic and explanatory in certain ways, even if they don't like line up all the way with the numbers. And in that vein, one thing that I just have to share, because it felt like one of those symptom things to me. I can't believe I hadn't heard about this before, but that Matt Gates's childhood home is the home where The Truman Show was filmed, where Jim Carrey lived in The Truman Show, which is itself in Seaside, the new urbanist master plan community in the Florida Panhandle. It was designed in the 1980s, first as a kind of a private master planned equivalent of a gated community, but also with this thing in mind. Probably many people have heard of the new urbanism, to kind of model it on some fantasy of small town America. But in the case of Seaside, also with like the most high-end postmodern highly paid architects working there. So there's like a Leon Creer building and an Aldo Rossi building. The Creer house is sort of like this New England white clapboard house with a kind of Acropolis or Parthenon sitting on top of it. It's just absolutely wild. And somehow it seemed to me that it made such perfect sense that that's where Gates was from. Like there's something about, I think, this, like the ludicrous emulation, and like the kind of the what when people talk about digital copying, they talk about generation loss, which is like when copies are made over and over, they eventually degrade in quality. And it really feels like RFK Jr. and Matt Gaetz, as a kind of child of the Truman Show, are just sort of these products of generation loss. Like there's something lossy, as they say, in the way that these copies come to us, and the kind of the poor pixelated images of cell phones and memes. Another helpful term, I think, is deep frying, which is like when you deliberately put an image through filters a bunch of times to lose quality. It's often used in memes, like of Shaq asleep and then waking up. And these are like extremely, speculative only, but I can't help but think that because so much of this is conducted through image culture and through, streaming and televised culture, that it's impossible to understand any of the dynamics if you don't think about the kind of, visual representations of Trump himself. Even this, it's like really out there, but the way that old films, when played on digital TVs, start to look like soap operas. Like there's this thing called motion smoothing, where the actual appearance of an old film takes on the appearance of something that was filmed on a handy cam yesterday. The fact that Netflix has like 3 films made before 1980. I can't help but start going all like media studies when I try to get at the essence of what, for me, especially why like 2024 is different from 2016. I just feel like there's something in the image culture that's changed that we kind of need to wrangle with as well.
I want to ask something to get into that before we circle back to address a few other things. But the media question seems interesting, and like many things that we've been discussing, like everything we've been discussing, not a place where we're going to find any sort of neat coherence, because we've been talking here about the internet and social media and memes and the way that cryptocurrency cuts across all of that. But at the same time, Trump picked Hegseth, and I think maybe like a number of people in his administration, because Trump likes watching them on Fox News, on cable television, and he's in so many ways the consummate TV president at a moment when no one under 40 has like actual old-fashioned TV. And it's not just Trump. Biden had so much of his worldview constructed by watching Morning Joe on MSNBC. How do these two things fit or not fit together?
I mean, the interesting thing is I heard RFK Jr. talking about this, and he was saying that his uncle, JFK, was the TV president, right? Famously the first televised debate and so on. And he was like, I'm more of a podcast president. So RFK Jr. himself said, I'm more suited to the podcast medium than television because he's got this throat condition that it makes it hard for him to articulate things in the first 5 minutes or so when he starts talking. So he's like, I'm not good at the soundbite. I just like to talk for a long time. And think about the resonance. I mean, if there are any kind of like repeated to death sort of lamentations after the loss of Kamala, it was this, we need a liberal Joe Rogan.
Which is so
idea.
Crazy given the shit Bernie took for going on Joe Rogan. It's amazing.
On Joe Rogan, right. Right. Especially because we obviously already have one. I mean, that's the outrageous part. I mean, I'm speaking to the liberal Joe Rogan.
I think that's my friend Hassan Piker, but but not a lib.
But anyway, I mean, I think, there's a temptation to say it's all images, it's this, that, it's like the blow-dried, airbrush quality of these entities on Fox News. But there's also the kind of like Richard Seymour point about social media, which is like, we've never written more, right? It's not just that we're looking at images, but we're also in like this experience of hyper-textual production, everyone posting and texting at all times. So, and listening, right? The podcast is also just this ability to like listen in long form. I mean, my students watch hours long YouTubes about arcane topics in ways that, I could never do. So it's also this kind of saturation of content more than just, I think, an image story.
I think maybe the only thing I would add is that there may be more transverse between TV and social media, podcasts, TikTok, than we sometimes realize. I think, the media studies people are alert to this, that what somebody may be watching long form on Fox News only needs to be a little clip to make some great TikTok content. And those things move back and forth. And so even though it seems like we're talking 2 or 3 different generations with radically different listening and watching practices, I think about the widely circulated stuff on Trump dancing, all his different ways of moving. Yes, very good. Dan's doing it for us right now, moving his body awkwardly and embarrassedly for most of us. But that moved everywhere. That was both on cable and it was in all kinds of memes. And, there are many other examples of that are important, more important than him dancing. But I think we have to become alert to those movements in ways, again, that maybe the left hasn't been so great at. we think of ourselves as very teched up, and I think we are teched up, but I'm not sure we've become as media savvy as the Fox people have and as Joe Rogan has.
I mean, one of the things that I think is relevant here is the nominee for the FCC, Brendan Carr. I mean, going back to our conversation about Project 2025, I mean, he literally wrote the section on the FCC for the Project 2025 document. And there, I mean, other than advocating a ban on TikTok, which is quite interesting considering Trump went against that, and basically advocating even further ramping up of Elon Musk's Starlink system to allow for satellite provision of internet service, which suggests, enormous federal contracts for Musk in the future, one of many new paydays for him coming down the line. But the one that I find especially interesting is his attack on Section 230, which is the part of it's the Communications Decency Act, which means that people can say things on user-generated platforms without the owners of those platforms being sued, right? It's a way to create immunity for Meta and X and Blue Sky from being sued for things that people say on their social networks. And this has always struck me as a kind of libertarian in the kind of civil liberties sense, sort of a provision. But Musk and now Brendan Carr have it in their target because they think that it also allows for those people who own and manage the platforms to censor and remove content, as famously was done with reports about Hunter Biden's laptop in the run-up to the 2020 election and so on. So I've been curious to see how far they will go there because people who know about this better than I do have told me that if Section 230 were repealed outright, it would just nuke social media altogether. Because if the owners of the platforms were liable and could be sued as if they had said those things, then they would all be sued constantly. And this would go for internet service providers too. So I'm curious to see what the play is there, whether this is just a way to try to intimidate left-wing social media managers or what.
Okay, my guess, since we've all been involved in some work by committee where compromises happen, is that some of what we see in Project 2025 was just tolerance of something some group wanted. I think the ban on pornography, for example, the absolute and total ban on pornography in America, as if it were possible.
I missed that.
But also as if the entire cabinet, because they're talking about a ban and a criminalization, as if most of Trump's cabinet would not end up in jail.
They're the most pornographic human beings I've ever encountered.
Exactly, Dan. I mean, you could not have a better lineup.
Matt Gaetz is famous for showing images, infamous for showing images of women to colleagues on the House floor who are like, why are you showing
Dan,
that?
You don't get to kick Matt Gaetz around anymore. He's gone.
Yeah.
He's gone.
How dare you kink shame Matt Gaetz? That's outrageous.
But, we've got Hesketh. We've got who's fending off his own allegations of sexual misconduct. We've got plenty of others
Musk,
who are
Trump.
in that zone. But my point, the serious point is, I don't think it means you discredit any viable proposition in Project 2025, but take some of them with that on that potential that they're in there because they needed to satisfy some Christian nationalist group and Catherine McKinnon that porn finally and completely had to be banned with no intentions whatsoever to do it. And I'm guessing that the FCC stuff is similar.
I want to loop back to some of this later, specifically the lack of any serious interest in sexual and moral piety. In fact, I think even a pretty intense attachment to the transgression of such pieties. But Quinn, you noted that a lot of capitalists sided with Kamala because, in fact, they did not want to see Trump dismantle the administrative state whose job at the end of the day is to reproduce the conditions for the reproduction of the capitalist order. Who Who then are the capitalists most interested in Trump's more radical approach? It seems the sectors that come to mind that seem the most salient are finance, tech, and fossil fuels. And then what do these capitalists want? Is it a short-term smash and grab opportunity, or are they trying to build something new, some new capitalism with new sorts of relationships to the state? And if it's the latter, why does someone like Musk need something new? The federal government, through subsidies to Tesla, SpaceX, and Starlink, have already done so much to make him the richest human being on Earth.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of taking them in reverse order, fossil fuel, it was a win-win, I think, right? I mean, Biden has allowed for more drilling licenses than any other president before, I believe, or he at least increased the number significantly during his 4 years. On the kind of green capitalism front, I think that most people in that sector have realized that they can kind of do both and, right? Like it's the famous story of Texas as like a leading oil producer, but also now leading in solar. So the kind of more and more and more principle, I think, applies there too. So people who work in that sector or have businesses in that sector and interests will always complain about regulations. There's never seems to be enough deregulation that makes them happy, but they were doing well under Biden. The shale revolution has made the U.S. the world's dominant oil producer once again. On finance, I think it's a pretty similar story, right? I mean, I think it was win-win for Wall Street, whether it was Biden or Trump or Kamala or Trump. The regulations that many of them complained about after 2008 have the sort of Dodd-Frank stuff has mostly been all rolled back, or like they've figured out workarounds, and it's not like there was many genuine kind of breaks on accumulation in the financial front in the last 4 years that I've been able to notice, right? I mean, huge run up of the stock market through the response to COVID and stimulus that was attached to it. It's more asset inflation than ever, arguably, which is good business for them. The tech one is the relevant one, right? If there was any place that there was a move towards kind of post-neoliberal democratic politics, besides the industrial policy stuff, which was, I think, very important, it was around antitrust. And Lena Khan has become a real lightning rod, obviously, for people in the tech sector. For fear, not necessarily of what she's done already, she hasn't been that successful, but she has talked a lot about and, assembled the case to begin very serious antitrust moves against the monopolies of Meta, Google, and so on. And so for some people in the VC world, this for them is like a existential risk, as they would probably describe it. The ban on mergers and acquisitions, the slowdown of concentration in the tech sector is for people who just want to get monopoly, as Peter Thiel famously describes it for us. Competition is for losers. I think they saw Lena Khan as this sort of nemesis that needed to be taken out at all costs. Whether that happens is an interesting question, right? Because famously Vance spoke positively about Lena Khan. The post-neoliberal right, such as it exists around Orrin Cass and American Compass and people like that, Matt Stoller, have been very positive about the antitrust turn under Biden. And so far, it looks like the nominees might potentially continue forward with that. So, the Silicon Valley might have something new to complain about, potentially. As far as Elon goes, right, if Hegseth goes 1,000 years back to the Crusades, then Elon goes 1,000 years forward into what he calls a multiplanetary civilization. And, having appointed himself the new Harry Seldon from the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov, it's his role to kind of bridge us from an earthbound civilization to one that begins to colonize other planets. And for the longest time, I thought that was just some sideline, haywire kind of fantasy hobby of his, but I'm starting to think it really motivates most of his actions. And if it does, then just being quote unquote the richest man in the world is not enough. I mean, it only matters when you can get that loader off Earth in such a way that you can begin to construct inhabitable spaces on other planets. And I think actually that's the telos of his plans. So he needs as much, political will, federal funding, leveraging of all material support as possible to get to that civilization saving goal as he sees it.
I think we also have to say big ag, big pharma, the family-owned corporations that Melinda Cooper theorizes in her last book. And they don't all need the same thing. I think big ag is in trouble if Trump makes good on what I think he will make good on, mass deportation, but also in trouble if it loses the infrastructure from the state that supports both its monopoly and its subsidies and its needs for research and development in fertilizers, in farming techniques, et cetera. So that's a very different world.
And retaliatory tariffs are also
Of course,
a huge problem
huge
for big ag.
Huge. Thank you for adding that. So on the one hand, I think they do want Bidenomics to go away with all its huffing and puffing about Roundup and other toxins. But they do want something from the state, and the same with Big Pharma, which depends hugely on R&D from the state, and wouldn't be getting that from political appointments, but needs it from the career appointments. So I guess what I would call for here, not from us and not today, but it's been a long time since we had a good left theory of the state, and we need one. And I don't think it will be singular, even though I just put it that way. But we need to understand what today, in both the history we're just wrapping up, Bidenomics and then Trumponomics, but also the broader projects of each to transform the state and to make the state work for certain economic projects, but also certain social and political and religious projects in both cases. Looks so different from those old Marxist theories of the state that gave us the choice between the state as an instrument of capital or the state as a structural reproduction of the conditions of capital. And those are inadequate, partly because we need to deal with different segments of capital, but partly because we're talking about more than capital. We're in both cases talking about large projects, and hopefully the left can develop one as well. Large projects of social and political and economic transformation with the state at its center, not as a casual instrument off to the side. So this is, I think, one of the things that seriously politically engaged scholars ought to be working on these days, but also people who are not in the scholarly world who have an enormous amount to contribute to understanding what the state is and isn't doing in right and left projects today.
I could not agree more, and that is the reason I will be interviewing Michael Denning on Policing the Crisis very soon.
I mean, I think one obstacle to that is the American fetish for the presidency. So I was thinking recently that it really is one of the many curses of American political life that you have this tick-tock of 4-year terms, right? So it allows for this kind of false sense of the mechanical movement of time, which also has a kind of, a pendulum built in. So whatever has happened for the next 4 years, well, we'll make better in the next 4. At worst, it's 8 years. And it allows for, I think, a kind of political quietism or fatalism around the inevitability of the unfolding of political temporality, as opposed to even parliamentary systems where it's like, you actually don't know. I mean, this government could collapse next month. It could last for 9 years, whatever could happen. But it also produces this sense that presidents are the somehow like agents of history and the primary actors who are able to kind of redirect the whole ship of state left and right as they choose. So, when Trump was reelected, or when Biden was elected, it was like, FDR is back. And what did that mean? Well, we'll get the New Deal again, because apparently, FDR just sat down at an easel and just painted a beautiful picture of the Hoover Dam, and then the New Deal happened, right? I mean, there's this incredible personalizing treatment of American politics, which is also, fatally put so much energy behind presidential campaigns, and we all know now, distracted from the PTA board meetings and the governor the governorship elections and so on. But I think it's also gives us a false idea of what the state is. I was thinking about when I learned about the Nazi state in graduate school, taking a PhD in German history. There, the questions of what fascism was weren't really the kinds we've been having for the last 8 years about basically, how evil is it? How much is it based on popular mobilization? Does it have an exterminationist kind of intent? But it was more about, how much was Hitler actually able to control all of the competing mandates of all of the people who were operating inside of the Nazi government at any given time. So is what we saw actually, the unfolding of one will from above, or was it just a kind of attempt to kind of work towards the party by many different bureaucrats fulfilling their own mandates that ended up accumulating in, of course, catastrophic outcomes and very successful outcomes militarily for a while, obviously, too. So I think that I feel like one of the themes of our conversation here is like the need to disaggregate Trumpism from a kind of essential core and think of it as like the pursuit of multiple and often even contradictory and competing mandates by different segments of the population. And with the rollout of the new tariff policy, we're going to see this happen in front stage because I'm a great critic of free trade dogmatism, but there's also a lot to criticize in protectionism in the way that it just allows for people to, with the most well-funded lobbyists, to simply storm to the front and find carve-outs for their own special interests. And that'll all be played out in front of our eyes over the next several months. But I do think it's worth sort of asking how the state works and what's it for. And the virtue, arguably, of someone like Elon Musk is he has figured that out for himself anyway, right? I think if you think of Teslaism as the way that he operated his company and attached himself to federal funding as a kind of a developmentalism, right? As a way to kind of do capital intensive, high-speed sort of innovative technology and R&D intensive projects at impressive speed, then, think about what has been done with the Trump trades, Palantir, Tesla, and Anduril, in basically rolling out like massively successful surveillance programs, massively successful weaponry programs, and massively successful electric vehicle programs. If that energy and that model could be used for different outcomes, which is what we're in the process of learning, right? If we don't see Bidenomics as a failure and now we turn away from it, but if we look at sort of Silicon Valley Teslaism as, building on parts of the post-neoliberal model that Bidenomics rolled out, then, in an ideal optimistic world, we could like dialectically see that Teslaist developmentalism turning into something that wasn't just, aggregating profits for this guy's Mars fantasy, but figuring out some of the kinks and whatever happened wrong with the rollout of the energy transition in the last administration.
I'm Naomi Klein, and you're listening to The Dig, my go-to podcast for the most thoughtful, in-depth conversation on the left. It's an incredible place to be exposed to new ideas and new writing, and if you can, please become a sustaining supporter at Patreon.
The Dig is a podcast produced in conjunction with Jacobin Magazine. And yes, Jacobin is a print publication, not just a place for online commentary, but long-form, serious print journalism and socialist analysis. The magazine is released quarterly and runs at around 160 pages, filled with award-winning design and the ideas that movements need to thrive. You can join more than 70,000 Jacobin subscribers supporting this vital work for just $15 for your first year. This is a huge discount available to Dig listeners. $15 gets you an entire year of Jacobin in print and access to the magazine's very extensive archive. You can access this deal by going to bit.ly/digjacobin, all lowercase. That's bit.ly/digjacobin, all lowercase. There's a link in the show notes. Let's get to defense, foreign policy, geopolitics, by which I mean let's discuss how MAGA both reflects and responds to the crises besetting American empire. Before we get to the actual personalities involved, and there are a lot of actual personalities, I want to assess the broader politics and ideologies at play. How is MAGA, and to what extent is MAGA, a response to this crisis over American decline that's emerged amid the post 9/11 forever wars, the rise of China amid the global economic crisis, most recently with the genocide in Gaza and the war in Ukraine? How has MAGA woven together this sort of anti-war politics? I mean, Trump even got to the point where he was describing himself as the anti-war candidate, particularly in Michigan and against the figure of Liz Cheney campaigning with Harris. This anti-war politics contradictorily fused with an intensely unbridled, unapologetically violent militarism, a sort of fortress American militarism that's simultaneously isolationist and bellicose. And this, of course, all relates to the economic questions we've been discussing, because whether it's military power or manufacturing jobs, it feels like everything about the dynamism of Trumpism and the torpidity of liberalism, it's all wrapped up in this general anxiety over a crisis in American primacy, and then complexly how people and various sorts of people perceive that crisis in their own everyday experiences. So how would you assess MAGA foreign policy and the political work it does?
I think you just framed it beautifully. That is, on the one hand, no protracted wars, no long wars. Those days are behind us. But bellicosity and dominance. And I think what we will see in Trumpian foreign policy is likely, this is all speculative, to be exactly that kind of move on the rest of the world. Get it done, bomb the shit out of them, get it over with. That will be his message to Netanyahu. It already has been. That will be, we don't know quite how the Ukraine thing is going to play out, but he will have zero tolerance for protracting on either side. And I think that is commensurate with his and Heskett's irritability with the existing military, that it's a military operation that is vast, organized, bureaucratic, it mirrors the administrative state in some ways, rather than quick, bombastic, impetuous, and decisive.
The military's woke.
Exactly. The military's woke, that drags it down even further, but it already, the irritability with these generals who say, well, there are four sides to this decision. Let's think it through. Or this is a really complex situation. If we move in, we're going to have to do this, then we have to clean up. That's not Trump, but that's also not any of his appointees in this zone. So the reason I was praising your framing, Dan, is I think the framing captures the on the one hand, bellicosity, muscularity, hypermasculinity, rage, belief that America has the right to do whatever it wants, wherever it wants, with anyone it wants, in the name of its people, but also just because. And I don't think it's accurate to call it a Schmittian world. I don't think it's accurate to say, we're back to something historically. I think this is the part of the business model of war and militarization is to no longer be treating it as a giant machinery of state, but something that just gets the job done. And I think that is also, to answer your question, part of the appeal to an American people so devastated by the forever wars. So many of the families who voted for Trump have that devastation in their personal stories, losses of their own, but also recognizing that these were wars undertaken in the name of patriotism that didn't work out. They didn't work that way. They didn't bring any honor to us, and they didn't do anything abroad. But I also think, the 9/11 catastrophe lives on as a, they did this to us and we didn't ever quite take proper revenge. And so Trump is the revenge president, and he's the decisive, bomb the shit out of them president.
Right. And just to segue into before you answer, Quinn, I mean, this in terms of the unfinished business from 9/11, Pete Hegseth, Trump's nominee for defense secretary, he's this person with a Crusades inspired tattoo alongside another tattoo of a machine gun across an American flag. And he wrote a 2020 book called American Crusade, in which he argues that Islam is controlled by fundamentalist forces that are trying to destroy the West through mass migration and higher birth rates, essentially the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. And he writes, quote, "Our present moment is much like the 11th century. We don't want to fight, but like our fellow Christians 1,000 years ago, we must arm yourself metaphorically, intellectually, physically. Our fight is not with guns yet." And of course, as a Fox News personality, he was a leading campaigner for Trump to, and this was a successful campaign for Trump to intervene on behalf of war criminals like Edward Gallagher, this Navy SEAL, who did such sadistic stuff in the field that his fellow soldiers reported him for it. And so there's this civilizational crusaderism combined with the rank and file troop knows better not only than the effete civilian leadership, but also the, like you pointed out, Wendy, the effete generals who actually are a replication of the effete and out of touch civilian leadership.
Yeah, I mean, there's this great line in Richard Beck's recent book, Homeland, where he talks about the rush to war based on false information and lies in 2003. And he says, what Colin Powell and company did then did more damage to democracy than anything Trump has done in his 4 years in office, which I thought was a very sort of powerful claim. But I think one that kind of, sets up this argument about not just a kind of corrosive distrust in government, but also something that, people went and fought and died for lies. And there's kind of two ways to respond to that. One, you either uphold this idea of the crusading mission, which was, of course, George W. Bush's own language, which is to say that you're kind of on the side of the angels and against the demons. But then there's, I think, the more Luciferian kind of attitude that I would say Trump brings, right? When I say that it's kind of satanic, I don't really mean that kind of analytically, the same way that sort of Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan saw themselves as kind of Randian individualists who were not interested in hypocrisy and were interested in their own kind and, come what may, which I think, this kind of cynicism that can seem so startling when it comes out and the crudeness that comes out of Trump's mouth is a kind of a liberating anti-authoritarianism that, Lucifer in Paradise Lost kind of represents. I mean, I tried to explain the premise of Paradise Lost to my 8-year-old the other day because he saw a picture of it in the newspaper. And I was like, well, he didn't want to, be under God's control anymore. So he rebelled and went down, lived in hell. And my son was sort of like, where's the problem? That sounds like a reasonable thing to do, right? Like there's a kind of a Luciferian quality to the rebellious energy. There's people have talked about it as kind of a superhero era or wrestling era, but the dragon has also been a very important kind of fantasy figure in the last 8 years. It's this sort of combination of evil and kind of force and kind of grandeur too. But as far as what Trump wants, I think we don't really have to look much farther than Netanyahu's Israel, right? I mean, it's very similar, I think, the vision. There's a celebration of sort of Spartan martial virtues, hypermasculinity, a willingness to undertake merciless, dehumanizing violence against a population considered less than human and having no right to claims of citizenship or rights. An Iron Dome missile defense shield is literally in the RNC policy platform. It's one thing they say they're going to do. And to do that, you need not just warriors, but you need technicians. And I mean, Israel is also the startup nation, right? They draw their tech founders out of the unit that specializes in intelligence in the military, famously. There's also a kind of self-sufficiency to it and total disdain for international law, of course. I think that there's many ways that this vision of kind of bombing into dust a population that is unwanted and then building condos on the top of it that we saw in Netanyahu's plan for Gaza 2025, that to me quite directly, prefigures the worst case scenario of how someone like, in its pure form, some of these people like Hegseth sort of envision the near future. And that is not necessarily a full isolationist position, right? I mean, thankfully, political scientists and theorists have started to map out what they call reactionary internationalism, and the way that far-right parties, whether they be Meloni, Orban, Putin, Bukele, Milei, Trump, Modi, can all coexist and cooperate happily and need not sort of withdraw into isolated, walled-off spaces on the world map. Israel is a perfect example of that, right? You can withdraw but remain hyper-connected. And the set of people that he has working on foreign policy represent that imaginary very unevenly, though, right? I mean, because you do have Rubio, who seems to suggest a still more old-fashioned approach to foreign policy. But then Tulsi Gabbard I think she is probably the most anti-establishment candidate that has been proposed for a cabinet post. I mean, she is serious. Like, she has gone pretty strongly against all of the decisions made by the Biden administration. She's standing up for Assad. She's effectively standing up for Putin. I would be surprised if she gets through confirmation. But she also is not necessarily inconsistent with this idea of a militarized sort of self-sufficiency.
I think you're right about Rubio, but what I do think binds the rest of them is a belief that you cannot fight your enemies according to rules, or let alone democratically. You need all the might of the sovereign. You need to blast through a rule-bound order, both at home and abroad. And that also touches the deep hostility to the CIA and, of course, the FBI, which, many of us on the left are still getting used to the idea that these have become right-wing targets. But they're right-wing targets because they're still just legal enough, just rule-bound enough, and of course, bureaucratic and procedural rather than decisive and impetuous. And I think we cannot underestimate the extent to which what Trump has built in his popularity, but also in his defense establishment, and will continue to build in that establishment, is a set of personnel, but also an orientation that goes much further than anyone ever imagined we could go in busting up what we now colloquially refer to as the liberal international order, with a very different approach.
Yeah, I think the shift of the military establishment and the military defense sector too, from that kind of, Yale to CIA pipeline to something new. I mean, Gabbard couldn't be further from that. And then the kind of defense sector. I mean, I saw that Palantir is now has a larger market cap than Lockheed Martin. And Anduril, which is, the missile startup started by Palmer Luckey, who, by the way, is Matt Gaetz' brother-in-law, which advertises itself. You can watch their advertisements on YouTube with a kind of a mashup of Neon Genesis Evangelion and Robotech kind of anime, showing a bunch of missiles locking into place, the Barracuda missile, and then them all just flying off into a big blue sky. And this sort of Japanese anime aesthetic, it's sort of like this vision of war as sexy and fun. And I think that, that cathartic and even like ludic, like release of total disinhibition without any sense of rules of engagement, that is again, the productive sort of exciting side of that expression of sovereignty or executive power.
Alongside Israel, China is a really profoundly bipartisan foreign policy continuity from Trump to Biden, and now Biden to Trump. Trump brought relations to China to the level of a new Cold War. And then Biden made that new Cold War the cornerstone of both his economic and foreign policy agenda. And notably, and pretty disturbingly, U.S. public opinion has tailed this bipartisan politicking on China. Polls show that the public went from not thinking too much about China to becoming ever more hostile to China. So the bipartisan Cold War, new Cold War with China, has really created, finally, its public. Is this zero-sum civilizational conflict with China where Trump and Biden both have wanted to work out the contradictions in their own coalitions and more broadly in American political economy? And if so, why? We see these continuities with Israel and with China, and these ruptures emerging with Russia and maybe on other matters.
I mean, I think there was part of the kind of Bidenomics coalition which thought that you could kind of stoke the xenophobia and anti-China energy to get to post-neoliberalism, basically. That if you really made people hate China, then you could create a kind of domestic consent for things like industrial policy, building solar panels here in America, doing huge loans for building semiconductor industry here in the United States. Some people, I remember Matt Iglesias saying that directly, like if we need to, let's do xenophobia to get to post-neoliberalism in as many words. Whether or not that's paid off is questionable. But I think that the reason why someone like Musk remains interesting is I think he probably has, you could say, a kind of a bear hug strategy also in part with Trump, which is that he doesn't want to get out of China. He doesn't want to lose the China market for Teslas and his products. And he probably, more than anyone who's in that kind of coalition around Trump right now, would be trying to seek some kind of arrangement between the Chinese leadership and the U.S. leadership. And it's one of those things that in my heart, I don't think it's really a core issue for someone like Trump. I think he's fungible on it and malleable on it. I think if he finds out a way that he can have his cake and eat it too with saber rattling against China, but still have access to the China market through third countries or whatever it is, then it doesn't seem to me like something that the group of people he's putting together so far doesn't look like it's something that they're going to go to war over.
The difference between the Cold War of the 20th century and what you described, Dan, as a Cold War with China is that it was so deeply ideological, and the previous one. And this one is economic. It's really, you cannot get many Americans worked up about the Chinese state or political system, and they would be hard-pressed to describe it in any event. And so many Americans supporting Trump are basically anti-democratic in their sentiments anyway, that wouldn't be an issue. So I agree with Quinn. If Trump can get his China problem solved by following the EU in negotiating Chinese companies set up inside the US, sharing technologies, etc., getting Chinese factories on US soil, that will be that. He might not be able to. And the tariff people and the effort to tighten Chinese exports might work against that. So there's deals to be made here, but I guess I wouldn't raise it to the level of Cold War, even though it's absolutely right to say that both Biden and Trump have harumphed enough about China that they can get the American public to accept some sacrifices, maybe even some inflationary results from a China policy that are necessary in order to rein it in. I still don't think there's anything equivalent to the anti-communist sentiment of the Cold War of the 20th century.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, though, that there's just not the sort of ideological investment in the sort of American way of life. It doesn't have that same stark ideological contest of, the free world versus the iron curtain, behind the Iron Curtain.
And once again, I think it's
which is
relevant that
mercantilism.
I think it's relevant that we don't have a USTR appointment, even though almost every other post has been filled, right? I mean, I think, and who do we have is a Treasury Secretary who basically said tariffs are a negotiating tactic. So it just seems like there's a lot more gray area there than even 2016 when you had Peter Navarro, Steve Bannon, and Lighthizer, who were all very, very intense
Yes.
Sinophobe China hawks for different reasons.
As I think we've noted a few times, that Hegseth, Musk, Gates, they've all they all have serious sexual assault or harassment allegations against them, as of course does Trump. Many, many, many. In fact, in the case of Gates and also Hegseth, there's a sort of flagrant sexual and moral perversion on display in many ways. We all know about Gates, but Hegseth, he's on his third wife. He fathered a child with her while he was still with his second wife, which brings me to a question about the religious right and its role in the contemporary MAGA right, because in some respects, the religious right is at the height of their power. They overturned Roe versus Wade, but in other respects, they don't seem like the same religious right, or they've dropped some of the pretenses that used to be so important to the religious right when we think about its origins in groups like the moral majority and focus on the family. What I mean is the politics of the religious right seems, and this is a phrase that keeps coming up, more Christian nationalist than family values, more about a Christian America or even a broader Christian West's power in the world and about Christian power within the U.S. than about pretending to care at all about any sort of pious moral conduct. They're definitely as focused as ever on reestablishing lines of gender domination. And again, they don't care about all these people being accused rapists, flagrant philanderers, whatever. I mean, that seems actually to be part of the appeal in the same way that the sort of masculinity exemplified by MMA fighters is part of the appeal. And so though Trump did overturn Roe versus Wade, he intelligently kept his distance from a national abortion ban, though we'll see what he does in practice. And the religious right on the campaign trail was mad at him, but absolutely powerless to check him. Do you see a shift underway from a religious right that's at least about a pretension to personal piety to this more masculinist Christian nationalism? Or is this basically the same Christian right, rife with hypocrisy, rife with naked hypocrisy that we've always had?
We have gone from the moral majority of the 80s to Christian nationalist, militarist, bellicose politics, emptied of anything very recognizable to many Christians of substantive faith. And it's not just about the sexual politics of the leadership. It's also about the content of that Christian nationalism and what work it does. What I mean, well, first let me say this. Trump himself obviously is part of what facilitated that shift. If Trump really was going to be the leader of a right-wing Christianity, then some adjustments had to be made. And early on, that took the form of he's a vehicle. He's been given to us by God. He may not be of God. And then
He's Samson.
exactly. And then it took a different form, which is no, that's who we are. We are these guys who are big, masculine philanderers, users of sex workers, sometimes assaulting and raping, fathering many children, etc., and still Christians. And Christian nationalism had to be the new form because that old moral majoritarianism wasn't going to work. And I think it aligns well with traditional familialism, which is, of course, also what drew in some Black and Latinx voters, although economics is absolutely key there too. It allowed for an attack on trans without turning that into a bold attack on feminism, because attacking trans is the easiest prey for attacking liberals anyway, but it could be out of the order of nature, whereas raping and assaulting men is right in the order of nature. Just go have a look at nature. That's what it looks like. And so the disinhibited Christian nationalism is a far more potent and powerful way to keep everybody inside the tent than the pious, restricted conduct of Trump's previous vice president.
The Ned Flanders style.
Yeah. Well, saying that this has happened to some degree tactically and strategically, my inclination is also to refract some of it through a nihilistic frame. It is a beautiful example of what happens to values in a nihilistic age. They become fungible, they become tactical, they become instrumentalizable, they become brandable. You can call anything Christian, even if right inside the house that you've just named, it's a den of iniquity. Again, I think it's important to mark this strongly because the left keeps imagining that hypocrisy exposed will make a person or a project fall. And it is true, it took Gates out of the running, but we had a very extreme situation there, and Gates might have gotten through. We still don't know. Or Trump might have thrown Gates into the ring so that he could get everything else he wanted because we got rid of that extreme. But the point is that in a nihilistic age, you can call things Christian and keep that naming practice in play politically while completely voiding the content. And that, it hurts some Christian souls, but not many. And, the Catholic Church itself has shown that it can survive degrees of scandal and cruelty and pain to its own flock that one would have thought in another age would have finished off the church. But it won't. It's simply a matter of payouts, expensive payouts in the case of the church, and some expensive payouts on the part of some of these cabinet members. But I think, Christian nationalism also has a very important imperial function. It was already, as Quinn noted, rolled out in the legitimation of the Iraq and Afghan wars, but it's sharpened and developed and refined now such that it covers, I want to suggest, both a white racism and even an anti-Semitism along with its Islamophobia. Christian nationalism is a kind of nice term for who gets to continue to dominate and who gets to continue to rule. Even if you tolerate some of these others in your midst, it's a question of what the governing principles, governing practices, and, as it were, supreme powers and imperial focus will be.
For me, with Christian nationalism, as with white nationalism, it's worth asking, what is the kind of unit in question? Because I think, as with white nationalism, with Christian nationalism, it doesn't necessarily mean that this needs to operate at a kind of full territorial level around the sort of logo map of the United States. And in fact, I would argue that part of the inflection change in kind of Christian engagement with federal politics is explained by this actually wonderful quote from Trump in July, which we all remember, when he said, in 4 years, saying this to Christians, you don't have to vote again. We'll have it fixed so good you're not going to have to vote. And many people interpret that as meaning that he was going to suspend elections from then forward. But of course, the point was that there's been these core demands that Christians have been making from the US government for a long time. Above all, Roe versus Wade, which he had already had a victory on, and that he will now undo federal constraints on certain kinds of expressions of belief and needs for conformism to such an extent that they will be now ironclad, and people can actually, this is the point, kind of decentralize and devolve and go back to their own spaces and practice Christian nationalism, arguably, but not at the scale of national politics. So I think that there are a few things that are trend lines over the last decade or so that are moving in this direction of what some of them call, in a positive sense, soft secession, right? Homeschooling is a very big part of this. Something that basically didn't exist 40 years ago has now, partially to the activism of someone who Melinda Cooper also wrote about in her book, Gary North, who's this wonderful sort of hyper-Christian libertarian gold bug who helped to kind of lobby the states to allow for permission for homeschooling. That's becoming more and more common. Another thing that COVID accelerated. The decline of the centrality of the university or the college as a kind of rite of passage is, again, something we haven't talked much about. But I think we probably all agree that universities are a soft target for the incoming Trump administration. And here again, there is something to the COVID shock that when parents heard what their kids were learning at universities, I know firsthand from some cases that they were taken aback by what they saw as the excessively progressive content of what their students or kids were learning, whether they were 6 years old or, 16 or 19 years old. So I think the Christians can be more withdrawn from politics if they've gotten everything they want, and if there's conditions for kind of a withdrawal from public life and a kind of reversion to smaller, self-organized communities, then one would not be surprised to see less sort of like activism around, obscenity codes or whatever these things, affirmative action, things that were impinging on their sense of the full autonomous self-expression.
It occurs to me here also that if you told me 20 years ago that a far-right political movement would take over the Republican Party in the United States and that gay men would be in multiple positions of significant power, I'm thinking Scott Bessent, Richard Grenell, Peter Thiel, and I'm sure I'm missing more, I would not have believed you. I mean, I can remember so clearly people like Obama and Hillary Clinton, being like, marriage is between one man and one woman. There are these intertwined wars over DEI, school reopenings, critical race theory, admissions to elite public schools. They'd really faded from the headlines by the time this presidential campaign got underway, but it was all really at the heart of the culture war for most of the Biden administration. And these were the ways that politics were directly, viscerally experienced by so many Americans, particularly amid the COVID lockdowns. And also in the wake of resurgent teacher union militancy in many parts of the country, which was a giant feature of American politics in the decade leading up to COVID. And then there's also QAnon, which emphasizes the welfare of children in its own insane way. And Quinn, as you mentioned, universities have been a huge point of conflict, from the most extreme case of Florida, where, amongst many other things, Governor DeSantis has essentially dismantled their public liberal arts school, to just this more general increasing neoliberalization of the university, where labor is ever more precaritized, the humanities are under sustained attack, and this spring, of course, where vast swaths of students were demonized as anti-Semitic extremists and subject to discipline and repression unlike anything we've seen on campuses in a very, very long time. Panics over children, panics over youth. This is, of course, commonplace, to be expected in moments of crisis. So my question is, what do these panics reveal about this moment of crisis?
I think we have to ask what's really going on with education and the GOP, even under the cultural war. Orban, Bolsonaro, Milei, Trump, all understand that only the uneducated will vote for them en masse. And I'm not saying the stupid, I'm saying the uneducated. Orban was really explicit about it. Trump, of course, famously said, "I love the poorly educated," at a rally. And the GOP attack on higher education and effort to transform it is old. It's as old as the 50s when it emerged with projects to take back what people on the right understood as an explicit ownership of university curriculums by liberals, what they called liberals. It escalated with Reagan and then with the Bushes, No Child Left Behind. The senior Bush ran as the education president. What all of them were trying to do was contain and restrict, especially public higher education, but not exclusively, contain and restrict higher education such that it would go in the direction of more vocational education and move away from liberal arts education. Meanwhile, what was amping up in that same period, of course, were all the programs that would become the materials of the bonfires for the right. Ethnic studies, cultural studies, feminist studies, queer studies, disability studies, DEI programs, and all of the rest of it. So we've had this war simmering for a while that I want to characterize not just as a cultural war, but a war on education and against education, except at the level of training for jobs on the right, and a war for a different kind of education on the left and among liberals. And I think it's easy these days to get lost in the crossfires of the cultural war and not see that deeper assault on an educated citizenry. We can see it now in Trump's hostility to the Department of Education itself, which is borrowed from Lindsay Burke of the Heritage Foundation, who wrote the section on education in the 2025 project. And that hostility pertains to what the department does. And I loved Quinn's point earlier about how the parts of America that are interested are suddenly getting a real education in what the administrative state does. We're suddenly really paying attention to what different departments do. And the Department of Education, among other things, administers Title I. It has about $20 billion for schools with low-income students. It administers Title III, which is for multilingual students or students who have English as a second language. Title IX, of course, for anti-discrimination in education. And about $15 billion for special education programs for disabled students. And then, of course, it administers aid and loans for college students, including potentially debt relief, which will soon be reversed. Now, all of these programs are, of course, identified with liberal Democrats, even though, as I mentioned earlier, slashing or shuttering the DOE, which is unlikely, I think, but slashing funding to it will ultimately land much harder on red states simply because they're poorer. They're the largest recipients of every kind of federal aid, especially for primary and secondary education. But this assault on education, I think we must understand as a way of, I'm going to be hyperbolic for just a moment, destroying the potential for an educated citizenry and hence destroying democracy. It works hand in glove with a move to a more authoritarian order. And that's why I began by noting who has been attacking education at this level in the world. And it is all of the hard right leaders we can name, from Milei and Orban to Erdogan to Trump to Bolsonaro and Modi. And in each case, it comes in as an operation that is clearing out the liberalism or the bullshit in schools. But in each case, it's also about privatizing, about defunding. It's also about turning students more and more and more into simple consumers of education as opposed to creatures you might develop as educated human beings. And as consumers, they're more likely to be vocationally oriented. They must be. They want their bang for the buck. And I think if we understand the attack on education in that way, we might also have more capacity on the left to defend an educated citizenry as opposed to defending particular things, some of which are a little bit indefensible, as we all know.
The stuff that gets into those journals that always
Yeah.
provides such fodder.
Yeah, and also the DEI stuff. You know,
Yeah.
we all roll our eyes at some of our own programs, and we know that. But if we were actually to be able to get back to the business of thinking, you know, what does it cost and what does it take to educate everybody in this country in not only STEM, but in civics, in basic literacies, in the arts and letters that allow you to parse what comes through the media at you, that would be a different story.
Like nearly every single one of these people, as far as I know, has an Ivy League pedigree.
Yeah, I mean, so extremely well sort of elaborated from Wendy there. It seems like there really are these sort of three sides, right? There's kind of the just tactical electoralism, which is if people without college degrees vote for you, then it makes perfect sense to produce more people without college degrees. There's the ideological purification side, which is like checking the content, which is what we have now in Florida, where, you know, you can't use the term Palestine, for example, in a syllabus without it being reviewed by people higher up. That's currently the case in Florida. But then there's this kind of economic instrumentalization of higher ed. And one of the things I found so valuable in Wendy's book, Undoing the Demos, is how it was really Obama that started pioneering these ideas under his term to say that we should actually index our federal funding for universities according to how much people got as salaries, you know, X number of years out of their degrees. And arguably, it's that last one because it kind of has a cross-partisan appeal where I think a lot of these policies are going to be rolled out. One example from Linda McMahon's America First Policy Institute, very concrete, is she wants to eliminate degree requirements for public sector jobs. So she refers to degree inflation, meaning that, you know, just using the term inflation there to say that somehow these are just useless expansions of spending, and that you should be able to be a federal employee with just a high school degree, in short. So this is that's really necessary if you want to hyper politicize the civil service, is to kind of lower the bar of requirements for picking the people who are on your side. There's just, I think, you know, it's good to approach it at these different levels. Like, one, what's the big picture, but then what's the kind of the technical way they plan on rolling this out at the same time.
Let's turn to RFK Jr. and everything that he represents. What does RFK, his politics around vaccines and wellness, what does that reflect about the way that far-right politics have increasingly focused around the human body in very particular ways? These desires for purity, virility, longevity that are visible everywhere from, again, obviously the anti-vaccine movement to less well-known, but I think very interesting, this right-wing conspiracy theory that the federal government is hiding the invention of so-called med beds that can cure any human illness. And then there's also, of course, Pastel Q, which was this sort of diagonalist path from yoga and wellness and fitness culture into the far right. Why does all of this resonate so powerfully in the way that it does right now, while Michelle Obama's campaign, which you may remember from, I don't remember if it was the first or second term, she had this campaign for kids to eat more vegetables and to not be sedentary. And it was framed as the zenith of an elitist liberal nanny state.
And Bloomberg's ban on
his soda
was
thing
framed similarly, right? Yeah.
Although we should just add, as we're setting up this question, that Kennedy himself is proposing to put very strong limitations on what those receiving federal assistance for food from the government, what we used to call food stamps, what they can buy. So Kennedy has that old playbook in his head as well, and it goes way beyond soda. It's basically any processed food, no chips, no crackers, no, he's got a long list. And of course, Trump wouldn't pass any of it, but that's another story.
Yeah, Trump loves McDonald's. The happiest moment ever captured on camera of Donald Trump is him in the White House standing before that giant stack
Piles of hamburgers.
of of lukewarm hamburgers.
Yes, lukewarm Burger Kings that he was getting ready to offer to a visiting group.
I mean, I think the one side of it is just this, personal maximization obviously is attractive, not just to the right. I mean, Andrew Huberman is a very popular podcaster about longevity. Brian Johnson is the Silicon Valley guy who's like using his son's blood to keep himself young. These people, I think, have cross aisle appeal, which is why, this diagonalist group has been sometimes just referred to collectively as radicalized yoga instructors. The question is, what produced the conditions under which people who wouldn't be in a block together politically suddenly see each other as potentially in cooperation? And there, I think the answer is COVID-19, full stop, right? I mean, this is RFK Jr.'s origin story, so to speak. The guy's an environmental lawyer. I mean, he's done important work protecting wildlands. He wrote a first book criticizing Bush and Cheney for their treatment of the environment in the United States. He had, other than the vaccine thing, pretty mainline lefty politics, liberal left politics. But COVID broke him. COVID for him was an infringement, and the term he uses is bodily autonomy. It was an act of overstep by the state, followed by, in his understanding, a series of orchestrated lies, which were led to back up the effectiveness of the vaccine and the lack of side effects or the lack of potential downsides. And his narrative is really interesting because he starts the narrative of state disinformation that led up to Fauci with Gary Powers in 1960. So he said the first time the United States government lied is when Gary Powers' spy plane was shot down by the Soviet Union. They pretended they didn't know about it. He said what happened next? The Warren Commission, after his uncle was killed, that's been covered up. And he produces this kind of like alternative narrative that leads, of course, straight to his family and the JFK assassination, which is extremely provocative and like sparking for a lot of Americans who have lived through all of those series of skepticisms and suspicions about overreach by the US government. So he is, I think he's someone who, if he was able to tamp down these like extraordinary paranoid aspects of his personality, at core, he does seem to be like a relatively competent person, but he's only got to where he is because of the paranoid excesses of the last few years of his life. And so in that capacity, I think he could be very dangerous.
I agree. And I will just add that I think we would need a whole other podcast on conspiracy theory to plumb this. And of course, you've done some, Dan, and there's also a marvelous new book coming from Zahid Chowdhury on this topic, and other smart people who are writing on it. But I think it's absolutely right to say he wouldn't have gotten where he got without the excess. But then there are other dimensions of him. And if we're just hoping that there's some competence in a domain that really has lives on the line, and we haven't even talked about other lives on the line, like mass deportation, but there are some lives on the line with these people, whether it's Gazan lives or deported people or health in this case. We can only hope, but fluoride in the water, that will be serious if he really manages to get it out. On the other hand, these are the parts that I referred to earlier as the wildness of a Trump transformative state that might take a long time to pull off, and Trump might not have it. I mean, Vance might not have it. We'll see. But, getting fluoride out of the water and transforming what happens very much at the state level in terms of provisioning certain kinds of health care, but also certain kinds of restrictions. That might take longer than this is where the wheels might turn more slowly than anybody who's going to be in charge of these departments can tolerate. So we'll see.
Yeah, and I think that, it is not too much to hope that someone like RFK Jr., even someone like Tulsi Gabbard, who I don't know if we'll have time to talk about, could be transitional figures towards a better kind of politics. I mean, Bernie was a transitional figure towards their kind of politics. But when RFK, for example, says in an interview I just read from him that at the base, people are responding to a cynicism and a despair that flows from the corrupt merger of state corporate power, he's not, right? I mean, he's not wrong, right? He's actually putting it pretty well. The way he has aimed that energy is, I think, misguided. But, if we can create a constituency of people who share a basic dissatisfaction with the status quo and who then express it in ways other than, aligning with probably the destructive force of Trump, then, it's one of those things where you hope for the kind of subsumption of something that appears to be bad and transformation into something that might be better.
First, when Trump first announced his first presidential campaign, he came down the escalator and in Trump Tower, and he declared that Mexican migrants were rapists and criminals, and some, he assumed, were good people. And it quickly became incredibly clear that border security, nativism, particularly focused on Mexican migrants and on Muslims, was the core organizing principle of Trumpism. Briefly, for a few years, liberals and people on the left also passionately cared about immigration in terms of defending immigrant rights. Then COVID happened, Biden was elected, liberals and leftists by and large stopped thinking about immigration. The right never stopped emphasizing migration more than any other subject. It is consistently the pivot point upon which all of right-wing politics turns. At the same time, in this most recent election, we are seeing the working class de-alignment from the Democratic Party take on an increasingly multiracial character. Though data is making it clear that while Latino men in particular did, in some numbers, flip to Trump, Black men really did not. Black men stayed home. That said, it is an increasingly multiracial, though still very white, coalition that is overwhelmingly organized around nativism. There was an article in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution where the reporter interviewed some undocumented immigrants in Georgia who said they would have voted for Trump were they citizens because they are hard workers, unlike the criminals who they presume Trump is going to target for deportation. How should we think heading into the second Trump presidency with pledges and perhaps very practical plans for mass deportation? How should we think about the role of immigration in American politics in the wake of the Biden administration and the Harris campaign capitulating to Trump's nativism, eviscerating asylum protections, Harris pledging to complete the border wall? How should we think about it all at this moment? Is racism the kind of conventional way we've thought about it the best way? Do we need to think more about nationalism? Why does it continue to play such an important role on the right, and what is the role that it's playing?
I mean, I would say that, immigration is probably the most important rhetorically, but the hardest to realize functionally. I think that if we set up the Trump coalition as kind of NatCons, growthers, and Austerians, I think when you try to do something like mass deportation on the scale that's being discussed, and then we know that this is very hard to do, but to then somehow like definitively stop the inflow of new migrants into the United States from over the southern border, it wreaks chaos and havoc with the economic assumptions that I think all three of those groups are operating with. I think the idea of cutting off undocumented workers from the American economy is a structural challenge that nobody has actually tangled with. So in that sense, I think it's actually quite a bit like the problem that Wendy laid out in her book, Walled States, Waning Sovereignty, where it's like, it's the intensity of the expression of the desire to expel and keep out these people, quote unquote, is an expression of the utter reliance on those people for the existence of the American life as it stands, right? So it seems to be an insoluble contradiction, which is why I think we saw basically half measures in the first administration, and then basically deportation business as usual across Democrat, Republican, Democrat administrations over the last decade and a half. I genuinely don't know what they will be able to do other than more sadistic acts of border theater to make voters feel like they got what they wanted.
What to make of Latinx voters? Is it racism or is it nationalism? And then maybe also the last one that you were addressing, Quinn, sort of, is it feasible, the mass deportation thing? I do want to just mention something that it was really an awakening for me when political scientist Christina Beltran said in a reporting on a study of Latinx voting, look, white people need to understand that Latinx immigrants in this country are closer to ethnic white immigrants in the 20s and 30s than they are politically to the experience of African Americans post-slavery, post-Jim Crow. They arrive, they work hard, they believe in getting ahead, they believe in the American dream. They're identified with the opportunities of this country, not with the harshnesses of racism and the rest of it. It's there, it's in their lives, but it's not shaping their worldview. And part of the draw to Trump is look, here's a businessman who promises to make entrepreneurial existence better. If that's what you're doing, if you're building a small landscaping company, or if you're in construction, or if your kids are getting ready to go to college. And I think that the fact is there's both racism and nationalism operating, as Quinn suggested, in the vilification of migrants. It's performed for anxious white people who feel like they're sliding down an economic hill. It allows them to have a displaced object of that slide, to understand it through a racialized other, rather than, I'm saying the obvious, we all know this, rather than through the effects of neoliberal austerity. But it is interesting that we have shifted from Trump's build a wall to mass deportation as the slogan. The second comports with where we began this discussion, the more muscular, militarized, vengeful, we're going to do it. It's war. It's no longer we're going to build a wall because, the Dems never did, and we know how to do that. And it's now we're going to go in an incredibly ugly way, using the National Guard, using the military more properly, and using ICE, and perform it for America. Can it be done? Leaving aside the economic consequences, which of course are huge, and every state in the West knows this deeply, from Texas and Arizona wrapping all the way up to the West Coast, but also, elsewhere in the country as well. But those are the places where the huge concentrations of workforces are. It certainly can be done. It can be done with a combination of ICE and military forces, but it's obviously a spectacle that might, I don't want to say backfire, but be too much. That is, even Rand Paul expressed horror at the image of armies descending on cities and rounding up undocumented workers in factories or at construction sites or outside lumber yards or elsewhere. And the other key question, I think, is how the military will respond. It is not eager. to participate in this progress. The Department of Defense was shocked by the suggestion that the military would be involved. And so I think there are logistical questions. There are also, what I'm suggesting, questions of spectacle and fear, not just on the part of Latinx and other undocumented folks in the country, but fear when and if you get that kind of assault on a workplace or a school
or a neighborhood. I mean, so many millions of Americans who might think they want this, if they see their neighbor 4 doors
Exactly.
down dragged out of their house with children screaming by the military. I
Right.
mean, that's just different.
So that's now what's before Tom Homan, the borders are. He claims to be ready to do it. Lots of bellicosity there. And I think there are those who want this badly. They want that spectacle. It's right in there with the wrestling and the rest of it that we talked about earlier. But I think there's also a question of whether it might be too much, even for the many, many people who chanted mass deportation now at the rallies. That said, it is going to be a reign of terror for our people. There are going to be 12 million people terrified starting in January for their futures, their families, in some cases, kids for their mothers, the kids who are documented, the mothers who aren't, in other cases, parts of families, whole regions. It will drive many of them underground. It is going to be, I think, the earliest and ugliest ramification of the Trump presidency. And it's going to fall particularly hard on, as you say, Dan, neighborhoods, but also regions that are not necessarily as easy to protect, for example, as where I am right now in the Bay Area, where we can build quick solidarity networks and be of some help as this kind of thing unfolds. But there are places out in the country, where the chicken packing plants are in West Virginia, which are such easy targets and would make such spectacular theater.
Well, Quinn Slobodian and Wendy Brown, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Quinn Slobodian is professor of international history at the Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. I've interviewed Quinn twice before on this podcast, once to discuss each of his 2 books, Globalists, The Rise of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism, and Crack Up Capitalism, Market Radicals and the Dream of a World Without Democracy. His forthcoming book this spring is Hayek's Bastards, Race, Gold, IQ, and the Capitalism of the Far Right. Wendy Brown is UPS professor of social science at the Institute for Advanced Study, Princeton. I've interviewed Wendy before, including on her previous very relevant book, In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, The Rise of Anti-Democratic Politics in the West. Her most recent book is Nihilistic Times, Thinking with Max Weber. She's currently writing a book on reparative democracy. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that, when you play the fiddle at the top of the state, what else is to be expected but that those down below dance? While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our operations manager is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Theorio Francos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also Instagram at thedigradio. And please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it's on iTunes or Spotify, please also rate and review us positively. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners, but what really does that is you spreading the word to your friends. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us at patreon.com/thedig and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.